So this is the book, and I think some of you have seen it. So the book was published this year, and I want to thank University of Nevada Press. And actually, I went to a publisher here in Oregon that I thought would publish this, and they said, people are not interested in Eastern Oregon, and we wouldn't be able to sell enough copies to justify doing this. So why would Nevada do this? But I was really pleased with what they did. And, I had a lot of photographs that I wanted to put in. They didn't say anything about it, so I was really amazed. The only thing they wanted was better resolution. So yeah, I was happy with that. So let's see if we can get this to go. So, okay, I think you would agree with me that Oregon's a special place, and especially the high desert country that we're in now. And you guys are in a wonderful location, being right near the mountains, and you can get over to the desert and even get to the coast if you need to. But one of the things I want to remind people is that, we have this amazing scenery, but keep in mind that these landscapes consist of ecosystems, and their existence is dependent on, all of the environmental factors that create the kind of environment we have. And one of the big stressors right now, of course, is climate change. And here in the desert, it doesn't take much change in precipitation to have a big impact. And that's one of the themes that I'm going to kind of stress here today, because Lake Abert being a very shallow lake, its average depth is probably between 3 and 6 feet deep in 1 year. And when you get 3 feet of evaporation, the lake pretty much is on the edge of disappearing every year. So I want to acknowledge some of the people that have helped me in developing the book and researching it and getting out and seeing parts of it, and especially Lynn and Keith Cruz. They lived in Valley Falls. They're just at the south end of the lake, and harvested brine shrimp from Lake Abert for 30 years until 2014, when the lake pretty much dried up and they lost their business. So they were one of the first casualties of climate change that I know of here in Oregon. But you can see I've got a list of different individuals and a lot of organizations that have been instrumental in helping me and involved with conservation of the lake, and especially Oregon Lakes Association, Oregon Natural Desert Association. East Cascade Audubon Society did a tremendous amount of volunteer work to count birds at Lake Abert for over 10 years. And those of you that know where Lake Abert is, it's a 2.5-hour drive from Bend. And those folks would go down there every couple of weeks and count birds. And that was incredibly helpful to understand how the birds were being impacted by climate change. And I want to thank my wife here in the back, Kathy. She's back there. She's been giving me tremendous support and encouragement to all these years. So, a book like this really can't be done without a lot of information developed by other people over many years. And these are some of the people that were instrumental in providing information about the lake. And up there in the corner is I.C. Russell, who was a geologist who came to Southern Oregon in the 1890s with a buckboard and I think his monthly salary was like $26. So, and he had to buy all his provisions and everything. But uh, Russell was, when he, during the off season, he he was in Washington D.C. and helped start the National Geographic Society. So he's a pretty important guy, and he also worked a lot in Alaska and other places. This guy here, Luther Cressman, you can't hardly see it, but he's got a revolver. You know, this was back in the wild days of the 1930s. And Luther Cressman was an anthropologist, and he started the anthropology department at the University of Oregon. And he was responsible for developing, the first information about Paisley Caves and the Fort Rock, sagebrush sandals. That This Richard Pettigrew, he he's also from the University of Oregon, and he did a archaeological survey along the eastern shore of Lake Abert in the 1980s. The highway department was going to do some work along there, and they decided maybe we should look and see what kind of artifacts are there, because when they put the highway in the 1930s, you know, if there was a rock with a petroglyph, hey, we just get the bulldozer and move it off to the side. And they went through a lot of what little level ground is along the lakeshore. And sure enough, a lot of those areas were village sites. And so because of that work, we know a lot about we don't know a lot about, but we know that there were quite a few Indian settlements along that shoreline, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. Down here at the bottom, Florence and Vernon Bailey, they were naturalists, early naturalists in Oregon. Florence was an ornithologist, and Vernon was a mammologist. And Vernon did the first work on mammals and produced a really lengthy treatise, which is pretty interesting because at that time there were still grizzly bears in Oregon. And the Baileys have been memorialized because of Mount Bailey, which is a mountain in the Southern Cascades. And I think it's probably in Klamath County. Arthur Einerson, it was a pronghorn biologist, one of the first pronghorn biologists in the country at Oregon State University. And he did the first book on managing pronghorns. Steve Vandenberg worked with the U.S. Geological Survey and did the first hydrological and geochemistry work at Lake Abert in the 1960s. And I was fortunate to be able to meet Steve, and he's in his mid-80s, and he came to Lake Abert because he was still interested in the lake. And we did some lake level measurements in 2014. So it was really amazing to meet somebody that after all those years was still interested in the lake and concerned about it. Ira Allison is a OSU geologist. He did a lot of the early work on Pleistocene lakes in Oregon, Lake Fort Rock, Lake Chihuacan, which Lake Abert is part of, Lake Malheur. And, he studied trying to determine, where the lakes were, how deep they were, and those sorts of things. So what am I going to cover in my talk? So one of the main things I'm going to talk about is why a book on Lake Abert. I'm going to talk about the ecosystem and also mention what Lake Abert means in terms of the effects of climate change on Oregon's ecosystems. And Lilia, as I mentioned, she's not going to be here today. So we're not going to cover that. So why a book on Lake Abert? Well, first of all, the lake it's the sixth largest lake in Oregon when it has water in it. And it's also the only large hypersaline lake in the Pacific Northwest. And what do I mean by hypersaline? Well, the salinity of the lake varies depending on how much water is in it. So when there's a lot of water in it, the salinity is about the same as the ocean, around 3%. But when it desiccates, the salinity goes up and it probably gets to around 25% salinity. And those of you that still remember your chemistry, sodium chloride, one of the most soluble salts, that's around 25% is when it starts to precipitate. So, and as Laurel mentioned, we're talking about migration, and I'm going to talk about the importance of Lake Abert for migratory water birds, especially shorebirds, and that we need to conserve these habitats because bird habitats are disappearing globally, and we need to think globally but act locally. And I know people like you appreciate the high desert, want to know more about the book. And so one of the things I tried to do is include as many photos of the flora and fauna to help people identify what's there. I mean, obviously, you guys know there's more than sagebrush out there. So in the little over a decade that I was going to Lake Abert, these are some of the scenes I saw. In 2010, we had a brine shrimp die-off. 2013 was the first evidence that I saw that the lake was starting to desiccate. And here you can see a lot of salt. Most of this is bicarbonates. And the lake not only is salty, but it's also alkaline. And it has a pH about 10, which is pretty strong alkali. And then in 2014, when I went there, I saw this scene. What was left of the lake had turned red, and that's because of this halobacteria. Halobacteria are actually a phylum. They're not actually bacteria, but they're actually more primitive than bacteria. And it's a group of organisms called archaea. And probably like you, when I went to school, we didn't know any of this stuff. Now there's so many kingdoms and changes that. So the ecology of the lake, one of the things that is typical about these salt lakes, you can imagine that it's difficult to live in a salty environment because salt in concentrations is basically toxic. And of course, people knew that long ago because they were preserving meat by just salting it. So it's a pretty harsh environment. So there's few species that have adapted to these conditions, but they can be extremely abundant. And we're going to show you some of the slides and whatnot of that. And the thing is that brine shrimp and these flies called alkali flies, which only live in this kind of environment, are very numerous, and that's what the birds feed on. So there's a simple food web, consists of these microorganisms, archaea and bacteria, algae, and they're eaten by shrimp and flies. And all of this energy gets passed on to water birds because there's no fish and there's no predatory insects like there would be in a freshwater system. So we've got a simple food web lacking fish and predatory insects, and that means more energy gets up to the birds. And that's one of the reasons why there's so many birds that can come to the lake and find adequate food. So the base of the food web, these are the primary producers that are, using sunlight and water and carbon dioxide and producing sugars. There's quite a few different species of cyanobacteria. they used to be called blue-green algae. The main plant in that system is this algae. It's a type of green algae that forms these balls about the size of a marble. And then there's these other microscopic plants called diatoms. Let's move on now to the invertebrates. And these are the brine shrimp. Over here, you can see three. These are female Artemia or brine shrimp, and they have a little egg sac right here. And these are the cysts that they're producing. And people call them brine shrimp eggs, but they're actually embryos, and they're ready to hatch as soon as conditions are right. And sometimes that could be decades. These three females are bright red because I collected them this year when there was this die-off going on, and they were producing hemoglobin. The shrimp produce hemoglobin when there's low levels of dissolved oxygen in the water. And that's usually happens this time of year when the water's warm and salty and there's less dissolved oxygen. And here are some of the cysts that they wash up on shore, and many of them will hatch next year when the water levels come up with the inflows. But they can remain dormant for a long time. And up here, these are these concentrations of shrimp I noticed. I haven't heard about that's occurring anyplace else, but they form these dense concentrations, and I call them a shrimp boil. I'm not sure what they're doing. So in years when the salinity is right and there's lots of the algae produced, alkali flies can be extremely abundant. And what looks like tar washed up on the beach, there's probably 10 or 100 million flies just in this one area of the beach. But the flies also occur out here in the water, and you can't see it, but all across the lake there are flies, and some of them are sitting on the water and some of them are flying around, and they migrate back and forth along the lake, probably trying to find new food resources. And these are some pictures of the flies that are feeding on the mud surface. And the flies have a pupal stage where the adults come out. I didn't include a picture of the larvae. They have a worm-like larva that lives on the surface of the mud. So let's do this, see if we can get this video to go here. So I made this video along the shoreline to kind of give you a closer view of what it looks like. You can see the flies out here on the lake, and this green color's the decomposing algae that the flies are feeding on. There's a lot of bird tracks in here. They've been feeding on the fly larvae and trying to catch some of these adult flies. These flies only occur in alkali lakes, and that's why they're called alkali flies. So I think that's, okay, moving on to the birds. That's the main topic. I've got a whole chapter in the book just on the water birds. And these are some of the species of water birds that come to the lake. I think about 80 species of water birds have actually been recorded there. All of these, except for this one grebe, these are all shorebirds. And so that's the main group of birds that come to the lake. There's Wilson's phalaropes. That's the most abundant species that comes to the lake. And unlike most birds, this larger, more colorful bird, that's actually the female, and this is the male. And phalaropes have this sex reversal thing The females still lay eggs, but the males do all the attending to the nests and stuff. And the females will lay eggs in several males' nests, and then she flies off and comes to the lake. There's also another phalarope there in smaller numbers called the redneck phalarope. These are two species of sandpipers that very common. Blackneck stilt, very abundant. Lesser yellow legs, you can see why it got its name. Willets, a fairly large shorebird, kind of medium size, just brown coloration. American avocet, I'm going to talk more about that. And the eared grebe, this is a diving bird that comes to the lake and feeds during the summer, and it dives feeding on brine shrimp. Avocets are unusual, and they have what's called sexual dimorphism, where the female has a bill that's more curved, and then the male has a bill that's less curved. And I don't know what this was. It probably was a female. You know, it would be difficult to know. You'd have to catch the birds to be able to do that. And but anyway, this the fact that these has this sexual dimorphism has led some people to believe that this is a mechanism for reducing food competition between males and females, so that the females, they're able to feed in more areas than males, and they're able to feed more effectively when the water levels are low. And they actually will sweep their bill across the surface of the mud as long as it's wet. And I'll show you a video of that here shortly. Let's see if we can run this video here. So this will give you some idea how abundant birds are. And in 2012, during several times during the summers in August, there was estimated to be over 200,000 birds. And you can kind of get a sense that, yes, there were a lot of birds there. Most of these birds are the phalaropes, the Wilson's phalaropes. The birds mostly concentrate at the north end of the lake, and it seems to be a result of wind blowing the surface of the water and concentrating food at the north end. And down here, you can see how dark that is. Those are all flies again. A lot of them. Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Species of birds commingle?
Oh, yeah. Yes. Yep. So I'll be able to answer all your questions at the end. Yep. So let's try this video. This show you how the avocets feed, and this is a female. So they can peck at things on the surface, and they can also do this behavior called sweep feeding, where they sweep the bill back and forth, and they're probably catching mostly the fly larvae and maybe some pupae, and if the brine shrimp in there too. Yeah. So avocets are one of the more common birds at the lake, and they arrive at Lake Abert early in April. And during the winter, they're down in Southern California along the coast and in Mexico and on down into Central America. But last year, the USGS put transmitters on, I think, about 40 avocets. Some of them were from Lake Abert, but these transmitters, I think they were actually connected to satellites. So every 15 minutes, they would get a precise location of the birds. And so what you're seeing here, those kind of purple spots, are a location where the birds have been detected. And the faint lines are where the birds were going. And You can see here in this image, a lot of the birds were moving back and forth between Lake Abert and Summer Lake. This is Summer Lake over here. And avocets, quite a few of them nest over here in Summer Lake, but they do a lot of feeding over at Lake Abert. The two lakes, I think they're about 25 miles apart. But the birds were also moving a longer distance. Many of them were going up to Harney and Malheur Lake. Some of them were going down to Goose Lake and Upper Alkali Lake, which is in Modoc County, northeastern California. So the avocets do a lot of moving, even in years when the conditions are pretty good. So apparently they're checking out different areas. And this is I mean, we knew that avocets moved around from older work that used old radio telemetry, but this new data from satellites is just so much richer. There's just so much more information. And I think if we're able to continue this kind of work, I think we're going to learn a lot about how these birds are responding to climate change and the desiccation of these lakes. So I included this video here because it's kind of fun to watch. So this is avocets mating at Summer Lake. This is the male, and that's the female just behind him there. You can see the greater curvature of her bill. So one of the kind of fun things about avocets and their mating ritual, it consists of a lot of preening behavior and kind of simulated feeding. But the male especially, when he's about to mate, he wants to make sure his feathers are just perfect. So he does a lot of this, you know, getting himself ready for this big event. So the first real sign that we're going to have this mating is that the female bends down with her head next to the surface of the water. And you can tell the male is so preoccupied with this preening. I mean, it's hard to know if he even knows the female's there. I mean, he's a pretty good-looking guy, but she's really patient. They said, come on, let's get this over with. You know, he's got to wet his feathers to make sure they're all slicked down, you know. He's quite a crooner. So, okay, we're getting closer. You know, there you go. Yeah, she's very patient. Look at it doing some more splashing. I guess this is to tell her, yeah, okay, I'm getting ready. Okay, there we go. Finally. And watch the little dance afterwards. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, avocets are a lot of fun to watch. I mean, they're really neat birds. Unfortunately, they do try to nest at Lake Abert, but there really is not good, secure habitat there because the shoreline is so exposed to coyotes that they don't have a safe place. But at Summer Lake, there's a lot of mud. They can also nest out in the marshes and areas where they're away from most of the predators. So I talked several times, I mentioned the Wilson's phalarope, this bird down here. And in 2013, we had an amazing abundance of birds. And this one flock was estimated to be over 300,000 birds. So if you remember back when I showed that one picture, I talked about the colorful females. Well, after the mating, they molt all those colorful feathers, and this is what both sexes look like. This pretty drab colored. So I made this video at Lake Abert, and you can see what they're doing. And they're not just swimming in circles for fun. This is how they feed. They create a vortex by swimming around. They're creating a vortex of water that brings food up to the surface. And these birds don't dive, and they have short bills, so they have to pick food off the surface, and that's why they do that. You notice some of them are going clockwise. There's some also going counterclockwise. And one researcher that studied these birds found that there apparently is a tendency for some of the birds to be right-handed and some of them to be left-handed. In 2013, when the birds were at the lake doing this, you could look across the whole lake surface, and the birds were doing that. And phalaropes, and the only other bird that I know that does this vortex feeding is the northern shoveler ducks that are also feeding on small animals. But the northern shovelers, sometimes the male and female or several birds will swim around in the circle doing this. But the phalaropes are really famous for doing this kind of behavior. The phalaropes also are pretty expert in catching individual flies. We'll see in this video. So, unfortunately, my pointer but watch that. You see this one fly out here? So the birds have this amazing stealth. Yeah, battery went out. They're really stealthy. And, they're just like a lion look at him. So he's so patient. And apparently that is the best way to catch the flies. If you just rush into the mass of flies, they just fly up and you can't really get them. So you have to pick out a single fly. Now, young birds will try to just rush in and try to grab flies. And sometimes, oh, okay, very good. Okay, I think you get the idea. Oops. Yeah, so yeah, here's the fly in case you didn't get to see that. Okay, let's go on to the next one here. Okay, so they also do another kind of behavior called foot puddling. It's a kind of a weird name, but it's what it is. So there's other kinds of water birds that do this foot puddling. Gulls do this, but they just stand in one place and they just stomp their feet up and down. The phalaropes are the only ones that I know that do this circling behavior. And I think there's really something in their genes that tells them to go in circles. And I think if we look close at their DNA, it probably has some kind of a loop in it or something. So apparently it works because you can see it picking up a lot food particles there. So there are quite a few springs along the shoreline. Most of them are small and they're more like seeps. But at milepost 74 on Highway 395, there's a pretty large spring. And these are mostly female Wilson's phalaropes that are finished breeding and have come to the lake. And one of the first things they want to do is take a bath. And so birds use these springs to get fresh water and for bathing. And that's how active the birds are. They're hyperactive. A lot of these shorebirds, especially the smaller ones, are hyperactive during this period. So Wilson's phalaropes migrate back and forth between their summer range, which includes a lot of the western half of North America, east of the Cascades, and over into the prairie provinces, prairie states, and then up into Canada. But during the winter, they're down here in South America and all the way to Tierra del Fuego in Argentina. So this, I don't know, 6,000 miles. So every year they're traveling about 10,000 miles. And this long distance migration means that they need to put on enough fat to be able to have the energy to do that distance. And it is believed that they do this, and some of them at least in just one long flight, which obviously takes several days for them to cover that distance and requires a lot of energy. In order to meet those demands, these birds have to feed a lot. So that's one reason they come to Lake Abert and other salt lakes. The biggest population of Wilson's phalaropes actually at Great Salt Lake, where over 1 million have been counted. But Lake Abert, Great Salt Lake, and Mono Lake in California, those are the major places where the birds come to feed prior to this long distance migration. And we're hoping within the next decade that these satellite transmitters will become so small that we'll actually be able to put them on the phalaropes and have a much better understanding of what their movements are like. Although the focus of the book was really on the lake and the birds and the other animals that live there, I also wanted to include information about the birds in the uplands because, there are, in fact, there's actually more species of birds that have been reported from the uplands in the Lake Abert area than there have been water birds. And these are just some of them. Many of them all you guys are probably really familiar with. For example, white-crowned sparrow, western scrub jay, California quail. Chukar is an introduced bird, a game bird that lives in the rocky areas around the rim, magpies, and these other guys. And of course, this greater sage grouse, that's found all over. But unfortunately, it's getting pretty rare. This sagebrush habitat is disappearing, and the sage grouse is not doing well. Moving on, I wanted to include some information in the book about lichens because they're really so abundant everywhere. And in fact, in this photo of this is the scarp of the Lake Abert, the rim. And when I.C. Russell was there in the 1890s, he actually commented on the yellow coloration, and he knew that they were lichens. And that is the cobblestone lichen that you see over here. And, that indicates that at least this slope is stable enough that the lichens can attach to it. Although there's a lot of talus slopes and stuff indicating that it's still pretty active slope. But there, my friend Steve Shihai, who is an amateur lichenologist from Klamath Falls, he identified about 70 species of lichens from around the Lake Abert area. So pretty good habitat. These are what's called crustose lichens, except for this wolf lichen, which is a folio species. And you guys have a bunch of that here in Sun River. The wolf lichen grows on a lot on ponderosa pines. One of the interesting things about the sunburst lichen, you can find it on almost every large boulder near the edge of the lake, is that there's an association between these limey deposits that this bushy-tailed woodrat leaves and the lichen. And we believe that these deposits made by bushy-tailed woodrats is from their urine, which their urine concentrates a compound called oxalic acid, which is found in plants and is supposed to prevent herbivory. But this woodrat has microorganisms in its intestines that allow it to feed on these plants. And there's also nitrogen compounds that the lichen probably utilizes. Along the shoreline, the lichen is probably getting aerosols from the lake that's rich in nitrogen, and that's why it's so abundant there. There are also a lot of higher plants, many different kinds of cushion mosses, little things, they're about the size of a quarter. The star moss, there's only a single fern that I know of. Many different kinds of grasses occur there, and an abundance of wildflowers in the spring, especially in years when there's a lot of precipitation. Because of the desert habitat, there's quite a few different kinds of reptiles, including, Great Basin rattlesnake, gopher snake, which you probably have around here, one of the most common snakes in the high desert area. And then you have a variety of different lizards. In fact, when my wife and I were walking around, we saw a small western fence lizard, which is probably the most common lizard in this part of the state. Then you have these two really unusual horned lizards, the desert horned lizard, which is about 6 inches long, and this tiny little pygmy short-horned lizard, which really is only about 2 inches long. It's just a real miniature form of this thing, but it's a distinct species. And it has a pretty small range. Most of its range is in Oregon, a little bit in Nevada, some of it in Washington, and it's apparently extinct in British Columbia. And then you got leopard lizard and several other different kinds of lizards. Amazingly, there are amphibians that live around the lake. One of the more unusual ones is this thing called the Great Basin spadefoot toad. And it's called the spadefoot toad because there's a horny appendage on its lake. This is actually a toadlet. It was about 1 inch long. I've never seen the adults because the adults are nocturnal and they're buried in the soil for most of their life, and they only come out at night to feed. They have these very large larvae, tadpoles that are several inches long. And the Pacific chorus frog, it occurs almost everywhere in Oregon, and it even breeds in some of the springs along the shoreline of Lake Abert. In terms of mammals, these are some of the more abundant and more visible species, of course, coyote, pronghorn, bighorn sheep, and the mountain cottontail, jackrabbit, and yellow-bellied marmot. And this white-tailed antelope ground squirrel down here, this is one of the only antelope ground squirrels that occurs in Oregon. And it's the smallest ground squirrel in the state, and it's about the size of a chipmunk. Mostly it occurs south in Nevada, Arizona, all the way down to Mexico. And it holds its tail just right above its back. You know, a lot of ground squirrels, you know, have the tail sticks up, but this one, it's right along the back here. And there's a small colony of these antelope ground squirrels that's on the western side of the lake. You know, I mentioned that people once lived along the lake shore, and the archaeologists that did the study in the 1980s actually called them the ancient Chihuahuacanians. And the Chihuahuacanians comes from the Chihuahuacan Basin that Lake Abert is in. And he found hundreds of what he called cultural sites. Some of them consist of these rock ring structures, which apparently were part of, you know, like a hogan, where they would have willows and they would cover them with mats of tules, hardstem bulrush. There's quite a few of these grinding stones present. And they even found this very unusual badger head pouch. And you can imagine these kinds of things don't preserve. This was found in a cave in the Chihuahuacan Basin. But mostly what you find are these petroglyphs, which are etched into the rock. And the reason that they're etched into the rock is that rocks in the desert have this covering of it's probably a mixture of different kinds of minerals called desert varnish, and it's still being debated just how this film occurs. There's some evidence that there might be microorganisms associated with that, but a lot of these petroglyphs along Lake Abert, probably no surprise, are lizards. And many of them are just right near the ground. And I think that actually a lot of them were done by kids that saw their parents doing some of these kinds of things and did them themselves. So these are probably just the western fence lizards, but this might be that desert shorthorn lizard. It looks a little bit different. And up here is this very rare iron oxide pictograph. So this is actually done with pigments. And there's no iron oxide available around in that area. So the Indians that did this were probably trading with other tribes. But these pictographs are extremely uncommon. That I'm not aware of any others in this area. So the lakeshore people lived at Lake Abert from about 3,000 years ago to around 500. And we don't know exactly why they left, but there's probably some reason to believe that the resources that they were utilizing at the lake probably disappeared because of climate change, changes in salinity. And the archaeologist that did this study, he found a lot of bones of a small fish called the tui chub. And tui chubs are well known in the Great Basin as being one of the foods for Native Americans. And so it's likely that climate change had caused the disappearance of these people. And these people that lived here, this was before the northern Paiutes migrated from the southwestern deserts up into Oregon. And they were what we call marsh or lake adapted people, much like the Klamath tribes and the Modoc tribes down in Klamath County and that area. So some final thoughts. The desiccation and the resulting harm that the Lake Abert ecosystem recently experienced in 2014 and 2015, and then again in 21 and 22, along with something that I'm sure you all are concerned with living here in the forest, is wildfires and what climate change is doing to make our environment much drier and much more fire prone. But Lake Abert being so shallow, it's really a very sensitive indicator of climate change. And the last time that the lake desiccated like it did in 2014 when I was there was back in the 1930s during the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl did impact Eastern Oregon, and there were quite a few years when there was very little precipitation, and some of the lowest flows in the rivers in Eastern Oregon was experienced then. And I think it's really important to support these regional nonprofits, these environmental groups like ONDA, Water Watch of Oregon, Oregon Lakes Association, Audubon, because these are the folks that are really going to be keeping us informed of the impacts of climate change on the environment, and also to lobby on our behalf to take actions to reduce these threats. So please do support them. Some of you probably already belong to some of these organizations, and that's good. So I want to thank you for your attention, and kind of one final thing is that, I'm very concerned about the future of Lake Abert and all these other lakes too, because they're so shallow and so sensitive to climate change. But at Lake Abert, there's a group of environmental organizations, including ONDA and Oregon Lakes Association, Water Watch, that working with the local ranchers in the partnership for Lake Abert and the Chihuacan, and we're trying to come up with some possible solutions that would allow more water to be passed downstream to the lake. And if that effort's successful, maybe we can apply it to some of these other lakes. All the lakes in basically Eastern Oregon are suffering the same kind of threats here. Okay, thank you for coming.